Hello and welcome to Those Two Blokes, although for the purposes of this particular video it's just one bloke tonight. It's just me, Paul Mount, reviewing a movie for you. It's a movie which has been doing the rounds, released a couple of weeks ago. It's currently screening all over the UK and probably across the world. It's called Hereditary, directed by a guy called Ari Aster. I believe it's his first full-length feature film, although I understand that he's made a few short films prior to making this first full-length film. And a bit of a divisive title, this one, and I'm sort of slightly in two minds about it, because the pre-publicity for the film over the last 3 or 4 weeks suggested it was a new dimension in horror, the most terrifying film you'll ever seen, and you'll see things in this you'll never forget, and it's nerve-wracking. And I'm not a huge horror fan. That's my first caveat in talking about this film. I quite enjoy a horror film. I'm more of a classic Universal Hammer horror sort of guy than the slashers and the Freddys and the Freddy Kruegers and Jasons and all that sort of slasher stuff. Leaves me a little bit cold. Not even a massive fan of The Evil Dead, which is probably heresy as much as this film's Hereditary. So I went in to watch Hereditary with my expectations quite high, expecting to see something I'd not seen before, and then sort of a new dimension in horror, which is what all the reviews and the pre-publicity had promised. So I came out 2 hours later, because it's a long film, just over 2 hours long, and I don't think any film needs to be that much longer than 2 hours. And I came out a bit baffled, scratching my head thinking, have the people who reviewed this film seen the same film that I've seen? Because I didn't really recognise the film that I've been reading about. Let me tell you why. It's an interesting setup, and the first hour is really very good, quite compelling as a drama. But I think the problem is when it goes supernatural and starts to become a horror film, it loses its way a bit. The basic setup is the film stars Toni Collette, who is a superb actress, of course. And she plays a young lady called Annie Graham, or young lady, she's a mother called Annie Graham, who lives in this big, imposing sort of American house, big house with her family, her husband and her son and her daughter. And as the film begins, she's mourning the recent passing of her mother, and it turns out that she didn't have the best of relationships with her mother, so she's a little bit conflicted about her own emotions. She sort of misses her mother and didn't have a great relationship with her when she was alive. So it's a sort of a study initially of bereavement and how somebody comes to terms with losing a family member, and particularly in Annie's case, it's somebody that she wasn't that close to. Without dropping a huge spoiler, there's another cataclysmic even disaster which occurs in her life, which absolutely devastates her. And this is where we see what a fantastic actress Toni Collette is, because she gives this fantastic performance of a woman who's just devastated and brought to her knees by grief. She's already been bereaved once, she's already had a terrible loss, then she has another terrible loss. It's not too much of a spoiler to say that it's sort of another family loss, but you sort of put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's gone through something terrible and then goes through it again, much closer to home. And it's just a stunning performance, and she's absolutely racked with not so much guilt, but grief. Although there is an element of guilt in the incident that leads to the loss of this family member. So far so good. It's an interesting study of grief and how somebody copes with grief, especially as her family is a little bit fractured anyway. She has a career as a miniaturist artist. She basically creates sort of little model settings and model scenarios. And she, as the film progresses, she sort of recreates things from her life in these models, which isn't particularly healthy in itself. But she's not got the best relationships with her patient husband, Gabriel Byrne, who frankly is a little bit wasted in this film. She's got a daughter called Charlie, who's played by Millie Shapiro, which is a very strong, striking performance. And there's also Alex Wolff, who plays the son Pete, who frankly is a bit of a wimp. He spends most of the time bawling and crying and whimpering. You sort of want to slap him and tell him to man up a little bit. But anyway, for the first hour, we're quietly chugging along the story about this family that doesn't talk. The family doesn't talk about its feelings, and it keeps everything in. And it's all a pressure cooker environment. Everything's boiling up, and things are coming to a head. They're having these frequent arguments about who's to blame for what's happened and why they don't talk about these things. And from an hour, you think this is actually very good. It's a drama, but it's not really a horror. Yeah, and there's a particular scene early on when something happens, which is nasty and quite unpleasant. But all the reviews, the previews said that once you've seen this thing, you'll never unsee it. This image will stay with you forever. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay, it's a nasty thing which has happened. But I don't know that it's so horrifying that it will give you sleepless nights. Or maybe I'm just made of doing this stuff these days. The problem with the film really kicks in around the hour mark when it starts to become a supernatural film, and I think this is where the director, who I believe wrote the script as well, I think he fumbled the ball a bit here, because I think we were chugging along quite nicely with the story about this woman who's had two terrible bereavements and has devastated her life. And then the character meets a woman called Joan, who's played by Anne Dowd, who many of you might recognise as Aunt Lydia in the brilliant Handmaid's Tale, and she's also appeared in things like The Leftovers, a very well-known American character actress. She meets this woman called Joan, a middle-aged woman, who's suffering her own bereavement. She goes to a sort of a bereavement group, and she meets this woman called Joan, who in time tells her that she's attended a séance and she's made contact with her own grandson, who's also died tragically. This is where the film suddenly starts to drift off the straight and narrow. Now it becomes a supernatural shocker, because, again, without wanting to spoil it too much, Annie sort of conducts a séance, contacts the spirit of a lost family member, but it turns out that that spirit is a little bit malevolent. And all of a sudden, what was a subtle, slow burn, and very well acted and well written study of grief and real people in a terrible situation becomes a rather schlocky, over the top, silly supernatural jump scare horror. There have been lots of comparisons with things like The Wicker Man and The Exorcist, and it's not in that league by any stretch of the imagination. The last hour becomes increasingly farcical and fanciful. Performances are ratcheted up into orbit. When Toni Collette, who's been doing good work in the first hour, it's almost as if she came back after the weekend away and thought, right, I'm going to overact my head off. And she screams and bawls and wails, and her eyes bulge and her veins are popping out in her throat. It's just a peculiar performance. It loses all the subtlety of the first hour, and we as the audience lose our sympathy, because all of a sudden we're entering ridiculous, ludicrous B-movie territory, and it does become increasingly insane. So it's a big disappointment. I find it very disappointing. I don't know where all these reviews are coming from when they say it's a new dimension in horror. It's the scariest thing you'll ever see. And people seem to be reading different things into it about... I think they're putting perhaps more emphasis on the first half and ignoring the ludicrous, farcical barrage of supernatural cliches in the second half. It literally is sort of jump scares and, figures of dead people appearing in the corners of rooms and possessions, and it's just very, very hokey. And you sort of think, well, how could this guy have written and directed this that was so good for the first hour, have lost his nerve and done something so different in the second half? It's almost as if he wrote the first half and thought, hang on, this is supposed to be supernatural. Oh, I'll throw in a ghost and a few weird things happening. The audience I went to see it, but I saw it on the Friday, the day after it was released, and there was only about 20-30 people in the audience, if that. And it was slightly embarrassing that by about an hour and a quarter there was a bit of laughter. Some of the dialogue gets a bit silly. Some of the incident gets a bit silly. And certainly the last quarter of an hour it goes completely off the rails. It's almost like a comedy. You could imagine a sort of a laugh track on it. So, a disappointing film. I found it disappointing. I was expecting, as I said, I'm not a massive horror fan, but I thought, well, perhaps this is something which puts a new slant on familiar cliches of the genre, but it doesn't. It just envelops and plays with those cliches and just delivers them up, pretty much as we've always seen them. It's a shame. It's a good cast. Toni Collette is brilliant, usually, but she goes nuts in this. Gabriel Byrne, as I say, is wasted. Alex Wolff as Peter is, he will irritate you a bit. It's a good cast and it's generally a good script, but I just wonder why it wandered into the path it did in the second half, where it was doing such good work in the first half. It's out there now. Go and see it if you're intrigued by it. If you like a horror film, you might find something to interest you. But I do think you'll come away thinking, well, it's a bit half-baked and I've seen all this before. It throws away all the good work of the first half and just does something very silly and ludicrous and laughable, frankly, in the last half. It's like two different films jammed together, and that's a bit frustrating. And it is frustrating when you're watching a good film, you can see it going wrong, and that's very much how I felt about this. But it's out there now. Have a look and see what you think about it. Have a look and put in some comments, subscribe and comment if you agree, if you disagree. Tell me what you thought of Hereditary, and we'll come back to you and perhaps read out some comments in a future edition of those Two Blokes. So that's me signing off, Paul Mount. Hereditary is on general release in cinemas around the world at this very moment. Go and take a look, but don't expect the horror classic that you might have been expecting. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more videos.